Who speaks for the Palestinians? Who is able to consolidate what the people have been going through and relay this existence as reflected in the realities of the past, present, and future? And who is able to tangibly transition this pain and suffering into a shared dream that captures the heart and soul of the rest of humanity, not only to foster sympathy and support, but to inspire the Palestinians as well as the entirety of humankind onto their irreplaceable journey from tragedy to fortune? Sometimes we take leadership for granted. We assume that leaders existed and were fairly competent in the midst of all populations. But in certain moments and places in the past, leaders that did indeed exist were lacking in any impact or efficacy. They didn't live up to the expectations put upon them. Their stepping out of the dark and into the limelight to lead the people was not necessarily based on ability or tact, but by good old-fashioned nepotism. Thus, the quality of leaders found in the Arab world, and more specifically in the case of Palestine in the early 20th century, were found wanting. They never rose to the occasion or transcended the moment, never united the people across all sections of society, never provided a singular vision in line with the signs of the times, never communicated to the masses in a language that was universal, never made sound judgments when challenged, and finally, never adapted to the circumstances that confronted them. And when analyzing Palestinian leadership over the past century, no one person or entity has translated this version of guiding or influencing a nation, or even at its most basic, ever truly represented the entirety of the Palestinian people. I'd like to split the last 100 years into three main eras. The first being the interwar period between 1917, the year of the issuance of the Balfour Declaration that identified the creation of a Jewish nation in Palestine, and culminating in the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. This era of leadership and its subsequent failures was mainly characterized by ideological differences. Those who began to aspire to a sectarian Palestinian nation, or a larger pan-Arabian nation including Syria and Lebanon, and finally an Islamic theocracy that would be the first of its kind. And within this dynamic of ideological multipolarities existed a Shakespearean-like tragic feud, akin to that of the mythical dispute between the Montagues and the Capulets, that of the rivalry between the renowned families of the al-Husseinis and the al-Nashashibis. These two families, on the surface, appear to have aligned interests in their vision for an independent Palestinian state. But there were core tribal differences that shaped their attempts to lead the Palestinian nation out of the mandate. The al-Husseinis represented the hardline, more religiously conservative cross-section of society. Since the implementation of the mandate and up to the eventual partition of Palestine into Arab and Jewish states, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was strictly from the al-Husseini clan. The al-Husseinis were anti-colonial occupation and favored armed resistance once it was clear that the British Empire were favoring large-scale Jewish immigration and settlement bias. The Nashashibis, on the other hand, were more of the pragmatists, favoring political compromise and negotiation, least of which was the intention to occupy key administrative positions within the mandate, such as the mayoral role of Jerusalem, granted through allegiances with the British, of course. Their moderate views and general acceptance of most partition schemes gave them a submissive reputation, and even at times were accused of treason. The British recognized the split in ambition from the very outset of the mandate. They were experts in colonial politics and invested great time and effort in diverging the chasm between these two prominent Palestinian factions. In consequence, Palestinian society became split both vertically and horizontally, along classes, ideologies, and tribal loyalties. The rest of the Palestinian notable, politically or socially influential families, such as the Dajanis, Khouris, Al-Khalidis, Tuqans, Nabulsis, and others, all fell within one of these two factions. But all these families didn't represent the entirety of Palestinians, not by a long shot. These were strictly the political or mercantile elite. Jerusalem, although the center of the mandate politically, didn't represent the greater population of Palestinians. Not the farmers, not the peasants, and not the workers of the territory, and definitely not the Bedouins who roamed the Negev desert. Now, compare that disunity to the Zionist movement, who, even though promoted vertical and horizontal splits within their population, retained a singular ambition and vision, regardless of any individual ideology or preferred methodology in achieving their goals. Such prioritization is reflected in the three key Zionist leaders during this era, who were totally different and opposing in beliefs, yet clearly identified the primary goal of a Jewish nation as the most important end result, and thus discounted any of their petty differences. Weizmann, Ben-Gurion, and Ze'ev Jabotinsky. One man, Izz ad-Din al-Qassam, came close to unifying the Palestinians. Unfortunately, such a unity was short-lived and only took effect upon his martyrdom. He was the only one able to bridge political and theological divides amongst Palestinian movements in fighting against Zionist expansion and in support of national self-determination. Al-Qassam was a guiding light in the path of popular struggle against the British and the Zionists, and was a success story in creating unity of cause for all layers of the populace and in shifting the people's loyalties away from the ruling elite. What is underwhelming here is how, over 3 decades, there was never a unified Palestinian front representing the Palestinian people. Many will blame the British for causing dissent amongst the Palestinians. This is true to a certain extent. By 1937, all Palestinian leadership were either arrested, deported, or had escaped due to the British outlawing them and their political groups. Nonetheless, this most likely wouldn't have happened if they weren't such an easy prey due to rampant division, weak coordination, and limited representation. If there had been a unified front, not only including the ruling elite, but infused with all layers of Palestinian classes and loyalties from all across the territory, then the British and Zionists might not have had such a free hand. The second era of Palestinian leadership begins with the culmination of the First Arab-Israeli War in 1948. Effectively, there was no Palestine. No institutions had truly existed prior to the war that stood the test of a nation torn into two. In theory, well-structured and implemented institutions don't disappear in a blink of an eye. There was no administration that could pick up the pieces, no civil service, and no army. This was another failure of the Palestinian leadership from the previous era. On the territorial front, only 2 zones of what was previously the British Mandate for Palestine remained. The All-Palestine Protectorate, now known as Gaza, was a small territory under Egyptian military administration, and that was led purely from an optics perspective by the All-Palestine government with Amin al-Husseini at its head, who was by then politically irrelevant. The other territory was the West Bank, that was now under the dominion of Transjordan, effectively being annexed by King Abdullah I as part of his kingdom. Key Palestinian political figures here became integrated with Transjordan's political class and eventually became full-fledged Jordanian citizens, and consequently their leaders, thus reducing greatly the Palestinian nationalist leadership choices while at the same time sucking the energy out of the Palestinian cause. These were individuals such as Wasfi Tell, Ahmed Touqan, and Anwar Nusayba. And this reshuffle of the Palestinian people changed them forever. It wasn't purely the ruling class who fled the war, but also a great percentage of the middle class, the high-value human capital of Palestinians, who fled to other Arab nations. They were no longer solely a suppressed people in their lands. They were now split into the colonized, the refugees, and a new diaspora. Division wasn't purely ideological or social. It was now geographical. During this era, no truly credible Palestinian leaders persevered. The Palestinian national cause wasn't Palestinian any longer. It was hijacked. The leaders of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan had imposed themselves and their agendas on the Palestinian scene. Imagine that. Months after your nation is reduced to a shadow of itself, you've lost everything, and you don't have one of your citizens to look up to as a guiding light. No one to speak of, counter, or fight the injustices that have been forced upon you. The third era of Palestinian leadership begins after the 1967 Six-Day War, when Arab leadership irreparably failed the Palestinian cause, and when Palestine ceased entirely to exist as a separate territory to that of Israel. And this era takes us to the modern day. But I want to split this era into 2 timings. The first being the time when Palestinians naively believed that they independently could retake their own rights and lands, mainly through violent resistance against the Zionist nation. This phase actually starts just before the 1967 war, with the establishment of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, in 1964. The Arab League, having failed the Palestinians, decided to offload the responsibility back to the Palestinian people through the PLO's establishment. First with a chairman like Ahmed Shughairi and then Yahya Hamouda. The PLO was now to be the supposed representative of all the Palestinian people, those within the occupied territories and those without. But there were those who would disagree with such an assumption of the collective representation by the PLO. Many political movements sprouted in the 1960s, all claiming that they were the true representatives and had the best interests of the Palestinians at heart. Fatah with Salah Khalaf, Khalil al-Wazir and Yasser Arafat, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine with George Habash, and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine with Naif Hawatmeh. Revolutionaries, Islamists, communists, Marxists, and militants. Division again was rampant. The PLO was fairly insignificant for the first 5 years of its existence, as it still submitted to the Arab League influence. Upon the appointment of Yasser Arafat as the chairman of the PLO in 1969, did the process of the amalgamation and representation of the Palestinian people start to take shape. In hindsight, though, what this leadership chose as a path of resistance led to its and its causes' disenfranchisement from the global community. It was a road of vengeance, violence, and retribution that was deemed terrorist and hence undeserving of international sympathy and understanding. Such incomprehensible decision-making was not isolated. Further dumbfounding actions by Palestinian leadership in the 1970s through to the 1990s, such as the events of Black September, an inter-Arab war with Jordan, followed by the PLO's and other Palestinian militias' involvement in the Lebanese civil war, and culminating with the support of Saddam Hussein following the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, that all but saw the isolation of Palestinians and the suspension of support by most Arabs. In parallel, and as a consequence of the Palestinian newfound voices, purpose, and mission, this era saw a great number of Palestinian leadership assassinated by the Israelis. Ghassan Kanafani, Kamal Nasser, Abu Jihad, Abu Ali Mustafa are but a few of the names that were labeled as terrorist and not resistance. Such assassinations greatly reduced the voices that were pushing for the cause. The second period of this era came with the initiation of the First Intifada. Such an uprising wasn't a top-down phenomenon where a strategy was put forth by the PLO for implementation. The Intifada was more of a grassroots movement that caught great momentum because there was a common shared experience of growing injustice, repression, and violence by the Israelis and their forces, thus feeding the perseverance of the Palestinian people. It showed that with little guidance, Palestinians were able to greatly reshape public perception and opinion. Shortly thereafter, the Palestinian top leadership finally arrived back to the occupied territories post-Oslo Accords in 1993, and the PLO became the Palestinian Authority. Arafat had returned. But as has happened many decades ago, after exile, once Palestinian leadership was consolidated back again in Palestine, infighting on a grand scale resumed. Jockeying for dominance over the Palestinian people meant the reinstitution of internal struggles for power, including treachery and the giving up of political rivals to the Zionist enemy. Arafat was soon sidelined with the ending of the Second Intifada in 2005 and was replaced with Mahmoud Abbas as the president of Palestine. And in the following year, the Palestinian Authority lost its control over Gaza to Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement. Here, the two authorities over Gaza and the West Bank diverged in their methodologies. The Palestinian Authority became a toothless, passive, and submissive administration, giving in to the whims of the Israelis. As an analogy to the rule of Mahmoud Abbas as the president of Palestine, if you're familiar with the Lord of the Rings trilogy, he kind of reminds me of Theoden, king of Rohan, when Theoden is cursed with weakness and despair, leaving his dominion to be overwhelmed by immorality and ineffective rule. That's how I see Abbas, hidden away in his royal palace in Ramallah, with his people struggling and suffering at the hands of occupation and injustice. However, in Gaza, Hamas took on a much more violent resistance that has seen continued efforts to counter the Israeli government's and the IDF's stranglehold on Gaza and its people. Regardless of the many moments when the IDF had cut the head off the snake, new Hamas leadership rose up to continue on with destabilizing resistance, as witnessed by their attack on Israel in October 2023, after which, condemned or not, has seen the narrative noticeably shift in favor of the Palestinian people and their rights for the first time ever. Many will accuse the ineffectiveness of Palestinian leadership across time due to the extreme British injustices and bias, due to a behemoth of global Zionist funding and propaganda machine that far outweighed and outperformed any Arab or Muslim capacity, or an ineffectiveness due to the lopsided military strength favoring the Zionists, or the lack of modernization of the Palestinians in specific and Arabs en gros, or the confused ideologies and agendas, be it Palestinian, Arab, or Islamic nationalism. And the list goes on and on. The excuses are many. But even with all these excuses, how was there no room for achieving unity at any expense or sacrifice? To bring together the Palestinians in favor of protecting their lands against an occupier, be it the British or the Zionists. No excuse at all for not prioritizing a unified national movement regardless of ideological arguments or struggles for socio-political power. Partition was coming for decades, and not one individual thought to take it seriously. By failing to prepare, the Palestinian leadership had prepared to fail. And this continued on for decades later. There was no excuse for not succeeding exponentially in fundraising for the cause later on in modernity with the boom of Arab wealth through a clear vision and mission, in disseminating a narrative that countered the Zionist narrative both factually and emotionally for global consumption, in winning over the cause as the true victim of Zionism. And ultimately today, there's no excuse for not doing everything in the Palestinian leadership's power to continue the fight, because there is no other recourse. We need to look back and criticize past Palestinian leaders, self-reflect as to why the legacy leadership failed repeatedly over the last century and why new blood is needed. Of course, Palestinians today can't do this on their own. With little help from the international community, Israel simply won't have it, won't accept a motivated, inspiring, and unifying Palestinian individual as a counterpart, and will do everything in its power to avoid such a reality. Charismatic individuals do indeed exist who Palestinians would definitely consider as such a counterpart. Leaders, though, who might never be given an opportunity, such as Marwan Barghouti, as with others who himself has been incarcerated for over 2 decades, with another 2 centuries left on his sentence. Or will this new brand of leadership come in the form of up-and-coming Palestinian personalities, who are making their names known on social media, in their fight for truth and in their revelations of the factual narrative on what's been happening in Gaza and the West Bank? Without strong and dynamic leadership, the ultimate victims are still the Palestinian people, who have yet to belong to their own nation, to their lands, to have rights bestowed upon them, and to live in peace and prosperity. The hope is that these new leaders will show themselves, appear out of the destruction that has been forced upon the occupied territories, like a phoenix that is reborn out of the ashes.